Thank you so much. I appreciate your warm welcome, and it's good to say hello to all of you, mostly in Toronto. I come to Toronto like once a month, so it's like my second home. So today we'll talk a little bit about research insight strategies and how to really make them work for two disparate groups, designers and decision makers. But we tend to overemphasize the decision maker stakeholder side. And so hopefully I'll tell you a bit of some stories about how I've tried to do this over the course of my career, some of the pitfalls, some of the wins, and what my takeaways are from all that. A little intro about me. My background was originally in computer science, and then later on I got a degree in cognitive science and education, focusing on human computer interaction at Stanford. So I have kind of a tech background originally, and then a human kind of side of the equation background. And that's where I really discovered what design and user experience was all about. I really had no idea any of those things existed, as an undergrad, which is true for most of us in this field, let's face it. And then I, had this nice second career, I would say, after working 5 years in technology. I had the second career in the UX field, mostly at tech companies, but also a couple of banks. So Capital One and TD Bank. I'm really very proud to say that I'm heading up the design team at TD Bank. It's been a really good experience over the last about 18 months or so. And I have managed Canadian teams before that at Intel and McAfee and Capital One, but now this is really much more in depth into how banking works in Canada as well as the US. So really thrilled to be here for that. The other thing I want to point out is I've had quite a bit of experience with different chapters of CHI. So I got involved in SIG CHI back as a grad student in '94. I was a student volunteer for many years, and then I was the chair of the student volunteers in the early 2000s. But then I shifted over to actually trying to contribute to the CHI community through publications. I did that a few times at a few different years. I've attended many CHIs, but these are just the ones that I've actually, contributed something to. But I also had the chance to speak at Bay CHI, separated like by literally 10 years, January of 2009, and then again in January 2019. And now I get to put TorCHI on my list here. So thank you very much for this invitation. I'm really thrilled to be here. So let's start off this talk a little bit about thinking about the kind of research and insights that work best for designers, design professionals. So if you think, I haven't said anything about different kinds of research insights, but what comes to mind when you think of research insights that work for designers? Does anything come to mind of certain classes of methods or or approaches? Anything anybody want to shout out or type in the Zoom chat? Zoom chat's a good way too, because I can watch that. Everybody's afraid. Okay.
I'll speak.
Yes,
I guess
go ahead.
for me, evaluative research would probably help designers the most.
I'm glad you said that word because I'm going to talk about it later. Evaluative research. So research that helps evaluate a design to inform or determine how to make it a better, or maybe even assess it. Does that sound right? Okay, that sounds good. Actionable insights. So true. We need the insights that we produce to be actionable. And this is not only true for designers, but also for stakeholders and executives. But what makes something actionable to a designer? Okay. Jillian says insights that can help them prioritize, decide what actually to work on or what to fix. I see another one that says formative research, and I love that answer too. I would say what I tend to answer here is qualitative research methods. Not that quantitative isn't useful to designers, it is, but in many ways, designers can't do their job, at least human-centered designers, without qualitative research, right? And it's important because qualitative research helps them gain access to the underlying roots of the problems that they're noticing that people are trying to solve, or maybe how they're struggling or why they're struggling with a particular design that they produced. And knowing the underlying roots or the kind of the reasons behind that is what allows them to actually do their job, which is to create or improve or to generate the work. So That would be my first answer. Now, in contrast, I'll ask a different question, which is similar in syntax here, but what kind of research works best for executives and decision makers? Anything come to mind? Your experience from your experience?
Formative research?
Yeah. Yeah. Not just quant, but quant for sure, because I don't mean to be stereotypical here, but executives and decision makers have a tendency to need to make a case that the decisions that they're making or the choices they make or the programs they're behind are going to work, are going to result in some kind of benefit to the business, or they're going to have a positive impact. Numerical data tends to work really well for this particular type of person and the role they're in. And so as a result, we sometimes see that executives have a very different kind of mindset and need from designers when it comes to the insights that we deliver to them. So how do we satisfy the needs for both? I know we can draw on a lot of things, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about some strategies I've used to try to solve the problems and the needs of both stakeholders / executives and designers. So the 5 I'm going to talk about today are these. The first one is around how you teach people about different methods to make decisions about which one to use. That's the first thing I've tried, and I'll just dive right into that, and then we'll get into the other 4 after that. So one of the methods Ilona mentioned to me, well, let me just dive into a few things I say. One thing I often say to start out is to recognize that there are many different kinds of insight generators out there. And at least in corporate settings, you'll find researchers like those of us who do user research, or maybe our cousins in market research. There might be strategists who are producing insights in some way, like maybe by synthesizing data from that exists already, or maybe analysts. So a lot of times analysts are in a role where they produce insights and data from data sets that they have available through the systems they have. And that's all well and good. They have their own kind of methods. The ones that we, as researchers use, I've created this little graphic that explains those methods that we have. And as Ilona said, I call that the landscape of user research. You mentioned it's come out in 2014, but I actually first created it in 2004, published it at Nielsen Norman Group in 2008, and revised it in 2014, and then again in 2022. So there's a new version that was produced last year. Take a look on NNG if you have a chance. How I usually explain this to people, and I'll breeze through these a bit because I know you all are fairly familiar with this. I'm not going to explain it too slowly, and you'll have the slides later. But what I do is I typically explain to people that you have a lot of methods to choose from, and I like to use a 3D kind of landscape to visualize which method I should use based on kind of the questions that they answer. And the 3 dimensions are as follows. The first is the qual versus quant dimension, which we've touched on already. And I describe qualitative research a little differently and quant research a little differently than maybe some do. I say that qualitative research is data that is generated by you, the researcher, directly observing or interacting with the participants, so that you're actually seeing it yourself directly. And I guess you could also extend that to using tools like Zoom, where you're able to interact and share the same context with the user or the participant. It's not exactly direct, but it's close enough, right? And so because of that involvement you're able to gather really rich data that's usually not mathematical in nature, at least at the onset. And quantitative research, in contrast, uses techniques that gather lots of data using some kind of instrument like a server log or perhaps a survey, and it can gather it quickly. It may be mathematically in its first state, or maybe it gets coded to be mathematical, and it's used largely to do comparisons of some kind, mathematical, not always, but usually. And so these two have different properties, and I often say that this is the main distinction is how they're gathered, the way the information is gathered. And they do different things. They answer different questions. The qualitative research answers the why, or the nature of the issue kinds of questions, or how might I fix this? How might I improve it? Versus quantitative does a really good job of answering the how many, how much questions. And we can think of this as this again. This is useful for designers, qualitative, because it inspires design ideas and helps us understand people. And I can show you later today that you can get findings, valid findings, even with small numbers. The how much, how many is really much better at that measurement and precision, and that's why decision makers love it. And there's this desire to have this, but it can also be quite blinding because of how delicate using large numbers can be. Okay. Second dimension is around the attitudinal versus behavioral dimension. And I sometimes say attitudinal research is really around the self-reported type of data, how people, what they can articulate, what they're able to say that they feel, using things like surveys or focus groups are examples of that. Whereas behavioral research focuses on what are people doing ideally without too much interference from us. And we might use something like eye tracking or data mining to look at something behavioral in nature. And that distinction really comes down to the difference between what people say and what they do. I kind of joke around sometimes that are these the same things? And usually people will come up with that examples where no, they're not. I don't want to be too crude, but probably the best example of that is people will say, you might ask people, do you wash your hands after using the bathroom? And everyone will say yes. But in fact, I think they had some behavioral studies that showed that a good and alarming percentage of people actually don't. So what people say, what they do are not always the same thing. And so this gives us a 2D space to sort of begin to plot some methods on top of that allows us to say, hey, if we want to understand how many people do a certain thing, we should be looking in the upper right. Whereas if we want to understand why do people say what they say, then we're going to look in the lower left and so on. And that's kind of the first two dimensions. This is the landscape from 2015. I think the newer one is on nnGroup.com if you want to take a look at that. But this is a fairly recent one that shows a lot of familiar methods that we all are probably knowledgeable about. And I teach a class for Nielsen Norman that kind of explains every one of these. But for the purposes of today, I'll just kind of dip into a few, which you probably all are aware of. Oh, but before I do that, I do want to explain the third dimension, which I call the context of use. And why do I call it that? The reason I call it the context of use is that we're talking about user research, users trying to use a service or a product of some sort. And the way that product is being used or that service is being used, that context will actually have a big impact on the way the study is set up or the method is set up and how what kind of data we'll get from it. So the four types of contexts I have are natural, scripted, decontextualized, or hybrid. Natural just means we're trying not to interfere too much and allow people to do what they would normally do without us being in the way. Scripted is where we are in the way because we need them to do or see certain things because we need to focus on a certain area or enforce consistency. Decontextualized happens in some attitudinal methods where it isn't practical to really use a product. It's more about it's usually the thing you're studying is not the specific product use, but it's more higher level or abstract, and it's not practical to use it. And then a hybrid method uses a kind of limited form of the product in order to really get at an aspect of the experience. I'll give you an example here in a second. Like right now, interviews would be one of the most commonly used methodologies where we don't really use the product, but we talk about whatever it is you want to discuss. It's much more of a pure attitudinal method. And of course, I think everyone here knows how to do interviews, so I won't dwell on that. The dreaded focus group methodology, which I sometimes call the F word of user research, lives in the lower left quadrant there as well, but has the quality of letting you talk to many people at the same time, which we all know has some challenges when it comes to methodology. But it exists, and it's an attitudinal method out there that's known. Field studies, probably my favorite qualitative method, where we go out into the real world, and it's a natural context of use because we're trying not to interfere with what they do and how they do it, but really meet people where they are. And so it has a lot of great qualities in that you're really looking at and seeing for yourself the natural variation that you might see out there. And I love this set of methods because they're just so incredibly generative and powerful. Concept testing is a good example of a hybrid methodology. This is where we show the user a limited form of the product or service. It could be an illustration, it could be a description, it might be a video, it could be a prototype, but it's not fully functional and it's not fully interactive per se. It doesn't have to be fully interactive. And it allows us to understand we're not looking at the usability of the product or the idea. We're looking at the usefulness, or does it meet your needs? Is it actually something that you want in your life? Not the specific way we've done it, but like in general, this particular way of solving the problem. And so that's why it becomes a hybrid, because it's using a limited form of the product to get at that aspect of the experience, namely, is it useful? And then surveys are tried and true method for getting a quantitative understanding of attitudinal behavior or attitudinal beliefs or feelings. And then in the upper right, sometimes I call this the most addictive quadrant, the behavioral quantitative region, wherever all the executives seem to want to flock, where we can understand, how much of people are doing things with our product, our website, our mobile app, or whatever. This is much more relevant to digital products, as you can imagine. But once built and available, it's very, very powerful and addictive because of its large numbers and because it appears to be free, because once you've built it, it's just there and you have sunk costs in terms of getting the insights to you. And then finally, usability studies live over there. They are a scripted method that we usually use to get at the ease of use or usability of a product or service, although you could do a little more than just that. And we tend to care more about behavior than attitude in usability studies, although we're obviously listening to what people say, but we know that what people say versus what they do in these studies are not always the same. People will say this was easy, and yet they failed 3 of the tasks. All right. The fourth dimension I want to mention is time, because all of these methods live inside of a context of us working in a corporation where we're building or creating products or services. And those, anytime we're in that kind of activity, there's usually a set of phases that we go through. I'm just showing one example of a product development process at the top that happens to be from the Nielsen Norman Group. But you might have your own version of that, where you go through these different phases where you understand your customer base, you come up with some ideas and concepts, you start to design them, you create a version of it, you build it, you implement it, you release it, etc. Well, beneath that timeline are really 3 main classes of research: generative, formative, and summative. Now, I know one of you said you like that evaluative was one that you mentioned, and I'm going to break that down a little bit here because I said I would talk about that. But first, let me describe these. So generative methodologies are those that are strategic in nature and answer the key question: what shall we do? What direction should we go? Where are we going? And so you'll see there are some example methodologies that help you with that, that answer that key question. And this is the time and space where both qualitative and quantitative methodologies are going to be helpful to you. Kind of depends on, if you have quantitative data already, it's great to make some decisions around where to focus. Use that to prioritize. If you use qualitative here, you're really doing it to deeply understand and to maybe understand the problem more specifically. In the middle phase, what we're doing, I call this is formative. This is really answering the key question. All right, we know what we're doing, but how shall we do it? How shall we design this to be the best it possibly can be, either the most easy to use or the easiest to implement, and work with our particular target user, et cetera. And the types of methodologies that are helpful here tend to be qualitative, because qualitative does a good job of informing how we should make the design better, how we should build the product. Now, the third one is much more quantitative in nature. This is the summative methodology, summative class of methods. And this is where we're trying to decide how well did we do. We're determining that question. We're trying to answer. And because that's the question, you're probably going to see more quantitative methodologies here. We could use some qualitative there, but for the most part, it's going to be quantitative, because you're trying to say, is A better than B? Is our product better than the competitors? Did we do better than our previous version? Those kinds of questions. Now, where's evaluative in this? Evaluative is actually these two things. If you do the research on on what is evaluation research, and I come from an education background, so my experience may vary from yours, but my training in academia was evaluative research fell into two main categories: formative and summative. The goals of them were different. Formative was research is designed in evaluation research to inform a curriculum or a design or something to make it better, versus summative is designed to determine, have you made it good enough? Is it better? So that's why I break evaluative. I don't use that word because it could mean one of these two subterms here. And I find this is a little more, this matches a little better with the product development lifecycle better anyway. So that's why I don't say evaluative. Okay. So what are the benefits of this whole approach I shared with you a little bit on, like teaching all about that? I think it's great for design professionals. And I like how some of these classes match the process. Great to nerd out with, but it's actually got some pitfalls. If you try to use this approach with decision makers, they're usually not that interested in being taught about these things. I find that it's better for them to learn by doing. Even some designers might just be better just to learn by doing. So I've had to dial back how much I use this kind of approach with stakeholders and executives because they're just not that interested in kind of being taught. This is not why they're here. Okay, second one. You could try to sell the benefits of qualitative research to your stakeholders or your executives. And now here's a question for you all. Have you ever used this when explaining to stakeholders, hey, we got this great study we're doing, and you only need 5 users? Raise your hand or say yes if you've done it. I'm just curious if anybody's done it before. It comes from Nielsen Norman. It's tried and true. And actually, it's based on some mathematical stuff. Now, I'm not saying this is wrong because it is right. The data behind this is correct. But the problem is that decision makers, they don't really understand that. And that's not a way that looking at a parabola like that won't, or I guess it's not a parabola, but an asymptote, but they won't really understand, why this is a good thing. In fact, you'll get this response. One sec. I've actually heard this quote before. I'll never make a decision based on research with just 5 people. If you have that happen, it's because people they're not really trained or versed in research or know all that very well. So it's just, again, going back to the teaching problem, it becomes difficult to convince them. So I'll tell you a little story about why this all happens or has happened. I'm going to go back to the early 2000s. And the kinds of discussions that were happening were these. Everybody was fighting about, you only need 5 users to test with. And then others would say, well, that's a parabola of optimism. That was Spool's stance on it, on that curve that I just showed you. Rolf Molik, another one of Nielsen's colleagues from the old days, did a famous study that said, where they had many different teams do the same usability study and had totally different findings. And so he was like, this methodology is bunk. What are we doing? What's wrong with us? And I think these 3 perspectives that were all positively intended, but they were kind of missing the point of what most of our studies are about. Until about 2002, when Medlock and all of his colleagues at Microsoft came out with the right method paper. So you may be familiar with that paper. This is what it looks like on top. This paper, if you haven't read it, I thought was pretty groundbreaking in this conversation because even though it was rejected by CHI, sadly, happens a lot, it was eventually published by the UPA. It showed a few key takeaways that I think were really helpful in this whole conversation about numbers of users. What they found was that it's not about the number of users that you should be worried about. It's about, because you're not trying to find the universe of usability problems. That was kind of what that asymptote was based on. It's like, how many do you need to find the universe of problems out there? That's not what usability studies are for. They are for finding and fixing the issues you do find. And so essentially, it's not really about this traditional statistical power and the kinds of information that you get from that, but more around is the finding, is it in a class of findings that you can then find a new solution for and then retest right away? That was what the whole right method did. And they came up with this really cool little metric that said, what's the impact ratio of the study, which is the ratio between found and fixed problems. The more fixed problems you had, the better the impact ratio was. So it's a really, really kind of important paper and still is to this day. In fact, it inspired myself and another colleague, Mike Cates, to write a paper kind of building on that. And we wrote a paper called How Many Users Are Really Enough? And more importantly, when? We submitted it to CHI and denied. Okay, fine. Denied the paper. Mainly because the way we described it was, we said that the problem was that researchers kind of, we ourselves, putting ourselves in the same category, we created this mess. We made such a big deal about the numbers and all that, and it's kind of caused more problems than it solved. If you want a copy of the paper that was never accepted by CHI, there's a short URL. Feel free to take it. It's available to you. But we did rework the paper, and we simplified it and made a version for User Experience magazine. I think this is a publication of the UPA. So again, the UPA comes in and publishes that, which CHI does not want to. And we wrote this paper and came up with a simple summary of saying, hey, an issue is valid when it has these criteria, these 5 criteria. The participant is representative of the target user. By the way, the reason we focus on validity, so if it's not clear to you, is instead of focusing so much on like how many users do you have and how many people had the problem, we said it's not about that. It's really about the nature of the finding. And if you have these qualities, like, is the participant a representative user? Did the difficulty stem from a behavior that's reasonable? Can you describe the problem really well? Can you describe the impact of the problem? And can you provide a rational account of the cause of the problem? And that all comes from, that's what qualitative and a well-seasoned and trained researcher is able to do, is to dig into these questions and answer them. I want to show you an example because I think it's easy enough to see when you see a video. We all love video. So I'm going to try showing you a video clip of 2 users doing a co-discovery. Basically, they're trying to register for a product called Stitch Fix. Stitch Fix is a styling service for, and they say everybody. Sorry, was there a question? Nope. Okay, I think there was just some inadvertent unmuting. So what I'm pointing out here is Stitch Fix. Do you have Stitch Fix in Canada? I'm curious if you have that available to you. It's an interesting service. Basically, you go in, you give them your information, like what kinds of styles you like. They send you a box, and you try the clothes on, and you send back the ones you don't want, and so you kind of have a wardrobe that makes takes the pain out of shopping for a lot of people. So they don't care what size or age you are. We've got you. That's their claim. All right. So I have 2 middle-aged females in a co-discovery study where they're both doing the same task, so we can hear their discourse, and you can see what happens when they are filling out the registration form, the profile form that explains something. I'm going to show you a simple little usability thing. See if you can spot the problem. Okay. Hopefully you'll be able to hear the audio. Let me see if you do.
How would you characterize your proportions?
Arms long.
Yeah, exactly. Shoulders.
Let me pause. Can you hear what they're saying? I just want to make sure you can actually hear it. Okay. So they're filling out the form, and you can see it's asking about what are your proportions, etc. Let's continue.
Average. Okay. Okay. You prefer clothes to fit your bottom half. Oops. Kind of like all these, but
I do too. I was going, well, wait. It depends on what I'm wearing.
yeah, exactly. I guess I'll say skinny. Rise, definitely high. Ankle.
What does that mean? Oh,
I
the
think
length
that
from.
yeah, if you like an ankle height.
Oh, okay.
Like the short, more of a cropped pant. I think that's what it is. Less is more. Keep them covered. Okay with arms. Shoulders are okay.
Okay, before I'm a little bit more on the video, did anybody spot a usability problem in that little segment so far? Anybody spot one? No? No problems found? Looked all good? Okay, so what happened was they got to a multi-select where the genes, asking about genes, and they could do multi, but they thought they could only do single select. So I asked them about that.
Okay.
Top.
Uh-huh.
It says right here where it says you like them all. What size of jeans do you prefer?
What types?
You chose, or you said skinny, but you both said I like them all. Is there a reason you didn't choose? Did you not realize?
Oh,
you
it does
could
say
choose?
select all that apply. No, I just think I saw the boxes and
Why, why
Yeah.
did you? Why do you think you didn't know to choose more than one?
Because the other questions were kind of like one answered, and then all of a sudden this was you could
It's a
have
single.
several. Yeah.
I thought the same thing.
Okay.
Yeah, because I thought, oh, you just only get to select one because that's been the process as we've gone along.
Okay, so simple little problem here.
Careful.
Oops, let me skip ahead. Do we think, let's answer the questions. Do we think these are representative users? Well, according to Stitch Fix's website, it's for everybody, so I'd say yes. Did the difficulty they have stem from reasonable behavior? They're going through and filling out a form, was it reasonable? Did they do something really weird? You might say, well, multi-select and single select are really, really like straightforward things that people should be able to answer. But they didn't catch that there was a difference for whatever. And I would say the behavior is reasonable. Can we describe the problem? I'm going to do that in the next slide. Can we describe the impact? Yes, we can describe it. If Stitch Fix doesn't have the right information for what you like, they're going to send you bad clothes that are not going to account for all the things you might like. And I'll give you a rational account of the cause of the problem in the next slide. So here's why I think this is a valid finding, even though there's only one observation. These target users, we said that these are valid users because they're included, they want everyone. But there was three things that happened here. There was a priming effect. So as you went through, we saw the same single select, single select, single select, single select, and it made you think that, oh, it's single select all the way through. It's like in my town of Carmel, it's a four-way stop, a four-way stop, a four-way stop, and people come to a two-way stop and they stop when they don't have to because they've been going through four-way stops forever. That's just priming. Okay, that happens to people. It's a known kind of phenomenon, and that's what happened. The second thing is we know something about form filling that we saw in this example. Like we know if you've ever done eye tracking, people don't read helper text like this. They look at the question and they go to the form element. They don't read that stuff unless they think they need it, unless they think they're having a problem. They didn't realize they were getting it wrong. So the only time you look at helper text or things like that are when you know that you're having a problem. But when you don't know you're having a problem, you don't read it. And the third thing is that the Stitch Fix designers chose to make the visual design of the form elements kind of cute. So like this is a single select that after you've chosen it, it rolls down into a circle with a little hatch mark, like going down a chevron. And that looks kind of like a check mark. So it actually almost resembles the same thing. And you can imagine an easy fix for this, this problem. That's how you can start to use qualitative the right way, is to understand the underlying rules of validity. What makes it a valid finding is not the numbers. It's the nature and the nature of the problem and the underlying UX design principles that you're seeing when you see people have problem and understand that. Okay. Let me ask you this. Have you ever done this? You're reporting your findings and say 4 out of 10 participants said they liked the feature. You ever done that? Or have you done this? 3 out of 9 had difficulty with this feature. Why are you doing that? When you do that, you are telling your audience that they should focus on the number, not the quality of the experience. People will ask you, they'll say, they'll say, I need to know how many people were had this problem. The answer to that question is, why do you need to know that? Or a few people had this problem, but here's why they had it and why it's important to address. Like the number this is not a method that's going to tell you the precise number. And it's not a method whose validity is based on the number. It's based on the principles and the underlying nature of the interaction. We have to make sure people understand that and not teach the wrong thing or sell the wrong thing. Don't sell people on, oh, it's only 5 and that's enough for making big decisions. It's really not enough for some things. It's not enough to quantify, but it's enough to understand the validity. Okay, so what do I mean by validity? It's such a big deal. So these are all the different definitions out here. I'm just going to focus on the last one that I like, which is validity is the extent to which the findings of a study can be generalized and therefore, in our context, acted upon or believed. Okay, that's kind of what we just talked about. So if you think about what validity, how it's done in qualitative research, if you're interested in that topic, here's a book that kind of goes deep into that. Lincoln and Gubo, this is quite a few years ago now, in 1985, wrote this book that goes into the nature of qualitative research, like field studies. We'll talk about usability in a minute, and they describe how validity is derived in this setting because it's different than quantitative. And they have a nice table that shows, if you look at what quantitative research and what most science looks for in terms of validity or reliability or objectivity, there are analogs in qualitative research that have similar but different terms. And so like credibility, transferability, dependability, and affirmability. So what I'll focus on here is what they describe in terms of external validity and transferability. So transferability has to do with having breadth and depth in the analysis, using triangulation in terms like multiple data sources, having peer debriefing methods, meaning you have multiple researchers who talk to each other about it, and then, borrowing from Clifford Geertz here, thick description of the issue that's kind of what we did when we looked at this interactions. We really went deep on the richness of that interaction to be able to get there. Okay. So transferability, one of the main takeaways from the book is that it's the primary responsibility of the one doing the generalizing. That means you as the researcher. If you're the person who wishes to transfer the results to a different context, then you have to make a good judgment about how sensible that transfer is. And you back that up with your knowledge of how likely the issue is or the principle is to be true for other people, as well as what particular issues can be addressed. Can we actually fix the problem? Now you may ask, like, well, how is usability, does this apply to usability? It kind of does, because we try to have usability studies be naturalistic, if you will. But in practice, we're trying to get a realistic sense of how people use the product, but we tend to script it. We tend to make it either consistent for everybody or make sure we're focused on a certain area. So there's a little bit of interference there, but generally speaking, I would say it's going to be it's kind of a yes and a no. You are doing a qualitative method, and the responsibility of you to know whether you can transfer something here is going to be a little greater. You have to be aware of things like, is what I'm finding an artifact of the study or the environment that I created, or is this actually something I believe would be true in the real world? So the responsibility gets a little bit tougher. Okay, so so it's your responsibility. So what works better than selling or explaining all this to stakeholders? Because we're getting into the meat of things that we all care about, but how about an executive? I don't think them understanding the nature of qualitative validity is going to help them. What does help external, like stakeholders and executives, is involvement. And that could be in the planning process, in the session, being actually there with people, or even the analysis, doing group analysis is something that makes a difference. Because when executives can see something themselves, it's much more likely to be believed and acted upon. If you can't get them involved, then clips can do a good job. Well-selected clips can do a really good job. A little story on this. side of things was we once took our soon-to-be CEO of eBay out on a field study, and we had him meet an engineer who was unfamiliar with eBay, but she was technical, had a technical job, and knew all about, other forms of e-commerce. And she just couldn't figure out how the eBay search worked. It was like it just didn't fit her mental model, and it was hard to figure out. And this executive came back on fire, like ready to change everything about the search algorithm and all that. And so I can tell you that seeing is believing, but you have to guide them a little bit and make sure they're not going too far. All right. The third section is around, let's just conduct both qual and quant. Now, I would say, back to eBay, that's a good thing to do if you can. In the finding, what happened right after that situation with the exec is we completely redesigned and rebuilt finding. That screenshot is from before, so it's actually quite horrible. And then what we did is we coordinated our work with the A/B testing team. So we invoked the A/B test in an A or B condition with people in a usability study, while it was also being done in the wild. And then what we took is the results from both of these studies into a single report to executives. And it was the first time ever that execs had a meeting with their research or insights people and had zero follow-up questions. Like, all questions were answered. What happened? How many people had the problem? Why did they have the problem? And is it just successful? So great to do if you can make it happen. This is a way to do it if you have these capabilities. I'm behind on time, so I'm going to keep moving along here, but I'm going to some of these slides I might zip along. Yeah, will do. Okay, so going back to a time when I wasn't at Yahoo at this time. This is when I was at McAfee, and this was our flagship product, where a user would find this beautiful, I wouldn't say beautiful, this pop-up that would show up and and ask people to do, to subscribe. The question kept coming up is this a good user experience? I would say that is not a good user experience. But the overall product in general, like the antivirus suite, was, not that great, but it made a lot of money. And so the question came up is, how can we prove that it's maybe on par or better than the competitors? And with a desktop app, it's very hard to measure those at the time, because you can't instrument it to see how many people go through and so on. And I really wanted to measure, the desktop experience. So I found and hired. I did a bunch of educating with people. I tried to tell them all about how, what user research was, how it's only one part of it. I showed the landscape. I talked all about that, and then I basically got money to do this. It was really benchmarking. And that was the big win of the day. But it took me $100,000 and 2 months to do a benchmark of 3 desktop products side by side. So Kaspersky, McAfee, and Norton. And I had results. Here they are. The problem was that, well, not problem. The good news was executives loved it. Like, they were so consumed by this. Oh my gosh, we have quantitative data that proves we're as good or the same as our competition. They finally felt relieved that they could prove that they weren't so bad. Design was like, yeah, it's okay, but I could have just had a qualitative study and been just fine. I didn't need this. Because of the time and money it took to do this, the takeaway is I can't do this more than maybe once a year at most. It's not something I'm going to be able to have ready to hand benchmark. I'd love to have numbers available more frequently, but it's just expensive to do. And Tricia Wang, in her talk on YouTube, or TEDx talk, kind of identified, she nailed what it's all about. It's about this thing called quantification bias. There's this unconscious value that is put on the measurable over the immeasurable. And so this is a great talk if you want to see it, but her whole point was that people gravitate towards that and they don't understand how to use qual. And she advocates this idea of combining the two. She says big data plus thick data equals a complete picture. And I really applaud her way of talking about it and doing it. So if you can do this, great to do. But let's just note that there is such a thing as a quantification bias that we can think about it, take advantage, and I'll talk about that in the next strategy. So should you do both of these things? I think if you have the time and money, you should, of course, but they should ideally mutually inform each other, kind of like what Trisha was saying, but also the example I gave you with the eBay finding. You just want to make sure not to make one better than the other because they're different. And that idea of cycling between them can be very, very helpful. And don't forget, there's other kind of dimensions of research you could use too. Number 4, here's where we'll talk a little bit about how you might develop your own metrics or get your own numbers out there. Because when you work with executives, you get this. You get these quotes all the time. You can't measure what you can't, or you can't manage what you can't measure, or etc. Like, people say they want numbers, and we know they do, right? And so that got me thinking in 2015 or 14 or so, like, numbers, any kind of numbers? So I started thinking about what kinds of numbers would be useful. And I know, like, when I look at the human-computer interaction cycle here, where the person interacts with the computer and we get numbers from the product, this is what executives are looking at. They're looking at, they clicked on this, they clicked on that, they did this, they said this in a survey, they did these things on the site, the conversion rate was this. Well, the problem is the actual experience is happening over here in the brain and in the heart of the user. That's hard to measure, except, our best way of getting there is probably through UX benchmarking, which I already showed you is time consuming and expensive. So how do we kind of get at where the experience is, or at least numbers that are more reflective of the experience? Empirical studies like benchmarking and online testing, I love them. You should do them. But metrics can also come from what I call analytical methods. It's maybe a bad word, but things like heuristic evaluations that have some kind of number behind them, or the peer method. That's what the peer method is all about, is taking an analysis and putting numbers behind it. And that's what leads me to that paper that I wrote back in 2016 and presented at CHI there, where we talked about practical usability ratings by experts. And this is put simply, it's a way to produce a scorecard that reflects the cognitive load of a given product by just focusing on the most important or well-defined user type, looking at how hard it is for them to conduct or perform the fundamental tasks, a well-defined small set of fundamental tasks, and even just looking at the happy path, the best way that those tasks could be accomplished. And by taking those things and breaking it down by steps, we're able to assign like a 1, 2, 3 rubric or score on each step of each task, and therefore get a full score for a task as well as a product. And color coding helps do that. It's basically kind of like judging a gymnastics, a performance. It's a very fluid, complex thing, but if you break it down into steps, you can actually rate it numerically, like the way Simone Biles would get rated in her performance. That's the 3-point scale that I use briefly. It's going on a simple range of Steve Krug's "Don't Make Me Think" is a 1 versus a 3 is that we believe that the user will fail or bail on this particular step of the task. And what's great about the pure scorecard is that, we have all these qualities. But what I love, and the thing I'll point out here, is that for any given one of these bars refers to a step in a task. And any one of these, I can go click on this and get a full detailed report of why did it get the score that it got. Like at this red, I want to know what's behind this red 3. I can jump to that part of the report and find out that, oh, well, here's a screenshot from it. And here's all the reasons why it basically is likely for that user type to fail or bail on this particular step of the task. So this combo of a scorecard plus a whole set of like qualitative descriptions of what makes it a 3 or a 1 or a 2 is a really good combo. And the reason it's so good is that you're leveraging this quantification bias to deliver some face validity to pure overall, and it gets people's attention, especially red and yellow. Executives don't like red and yellow, I found. And then you're able to produce this really good roadmap of all the things you could do to fix that red and make it a yellow, or that yellow and make it a green, which is it's the idea of applicability, making it super applicable. So where do these kinds of insights come from? Well, they come from the researcher's previous experience doing qualitative. If you've done qualitative research with a particular user type, or you're going to have a lot of really informed ideas around the kinds of problems and the nature of the issues that people come into. And so it's going to make you more accurate in making these judgments. Your pattern recognition and your ability to apply heuristics. If you've been doing this for a while, you probably have these in your, in the can, if you will. And then the pure method defines a way that this team produces the ratings through discussion and iterative reliability to kind of hold them to a certain standard. I'm not teaching you how to do pure. I'm just giving you a little bit about how that works. And now how that relates to validity is that if you look at other related ways of producing numbers like that, I've had some people say, well, this could just be a bunch of groupthink if people do that. Well, it's not groupthink, because we're not talking about regular old people. We're talking about researchers who have dedicated themselves to understanding and being objective and like discussing and coming down with an answer. And the same thing has been done in other domains. In this book called Super Forecasting, where people learn to make predictions really reliably, it's really very simple. It's similar, but the people who do it have to have the same kind of attributes that I look for when I train people in pure. They have to have this ability to be, what's listed here, open-minded, humble, etc. Okay, how do we use these numbers to motivate? Well, I've used these numbers to motivate by comparing a product over time. This is a product that was an alpha, beta, and actual release. And so this alpha phase was, anyway, you can see how it got better and it made everybody feel better. Or you can compare your product versus another one, a competitive, and that usually lights the fire underneath executives to get moving, because they don't like to lose against their competitors. And then finally, you can show products against each other. And that's not exactly a fair comparison, but when we did this, we could see how, one suite versus a different product, would fare. And it would just create a little bit of healthy competition internally to get your product to be better than the others. Okay, so I'm almost done. So I know we're near at the top of the hour, and I will wrap up very shortly. Is that okay, Alana? Okay. So what should you know about creating your own metrics? I don't think it's that easy, but because you got to take your time and iterate on it. It took me a couple of years to get pure working. But what's great is you could create something highly relevant for your organization. There are examples of people that have created their own metrics that make sense for their org. Pure is intended to be something that can be used in almost any context. It's kind of built that way. I'll tell you, here's a challenge though. I haven't figured out yet how to make a universal methodology or number system to assess user needs. And I'd like to do that. So if anybody wants to partner with me on it someday, let me know. Finally, the last strategy that I want to touch on before we wrap up is leading with design. Now, one question I ask at times is design a science or is it in the humanities? Well, some people say it's kind of both, right? Well, because you use a scientific method in human-centered design, but it's creative and artistic, and so there's something there. Nigel Cross would say, no, it's neither. It's its own discipline, right? It's got its own, and there's some truth to that, because design is not, its whole goal is to be more instead of scientific, where it's trying to build a theory and test it, it's really trying to create a solution from a set of unknowns. And so it's got a different kind of nature to it. And if you look at how design is done and the design process, they all use insights, right? They all have insights as part of them. These are just 4 examples of different methodologies or different design processes. I'll zoom in on one of them here. Just as one that I built with a partner a while back, which is, kind of the standard set of phases here. And the way insights impact the design process is different along the way, but it's not the same as it would be in science. Like in the beginning, insights are used to really deeply understand and then ultimately help us reframe the problem to solve and rethink what that is. And that is then used to inspire creative ideas that we might have or concepts that we might pursue, which we then assess to determine which one's the right concept to go with. And then as we get into the detailed design, where we're using usability studies to kind of inform the design and ensure that it's easy to use. And ultimately, after we build it, we can assess again. So the insights impact the design process, but in a way that's not strictly the same as either science or the way that decision makers would. It's really much more varied in nature, depending on the point. Now that might sound like design thinking to you, which I mentioned because it is similar. It is almost really the same, the design process that I described in design thinking. And you should use that to your advantage with your decision makers and executives, because design thinking has had all this horsepower behind it from various entities to kind of sell the idea of design to business people. And it's become a good way to get the focus back on being customer-centric or human-centric. And that's something you can leverage to your advantage. And then the other great thing is that you can tie, depending on what kind of product development methodology you have, whether it's agile or lean or whatever, you can tie your design process to that if you make a few modifications to it. Okay, so some takeaways here are all the strategies I talked about are they're great, but they're not perfect either. So when we're teaching using the teaching method, read the room, just make sure that you're teaching it to the right people. Not everybody wants to know it. When you try to sell the benefits of qual, then focus on the why, involve the stakeholders, and make sure you show the work, show the clips, show the impact. Those are the things to focus on then. Doing qual and quant, I would say do both when you have the money, but don't forget to tie the two together if you can, make them mutually informative. And then developing your own metrics, it's a great way to use the quantification bias. It works on almost any kind of metric there is out there, and I can tell you that it's a real phenomenon. And finally, leading with the design process. It's really not, when you do that, you're not really focusing on the insights, but more about what you can ultimately design and build. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. I am 4 minutes over. I think that was reasonable. Hope that was okay. I'll stop there. If you want to copy these slides, here's a QR code or a short customized URL for TorCHI. I'm happy to take any questions.